Hey, travelers, welcome back to Relish the Journey. This episode is one I'm excited about because it dives into the uncomfortable but getting more popular topic of mental health and all of our mental health journeys, right? We've all struggled with some form of this, whether or not we like to admit it, whether it's some social anxiety, mild depression, or chronic cases that maybe we didn't know we had because no one quite talked about us and we didn't know how to deal with it. Well, Jessi Beyer is our guest this week, and this is what she does. And she's a speaker, an author, and a mental health advocate. And she's going to break down her journey and also steps that we can all take to help repair some trauma that we may have experienced. So it's a great episode. Take a listen. And at the end, make sure you share it with somebody that you know could also benefit from her message. Let's get started. Jessi, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. It's great to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So I'm going to read a line from your website. You got nice marketing, by the way. We'll just start there.
Thank you.
a lot of info out there. It was good to get to know you before talking to you tonight. So on the website, it says that you are a speaker, author, mental health advocate, and you're on a mission to help those around you design lives they love waking up to. So first question really is, why? Right? The big vague question. But, you could be doing a lot of things with yourself, right? If you're doing all these things and you're certainly smart, you could tackle a lot of different jobs. What makes you want to do this? Mm-hmm. Why did you choose to take this path?
Mm-hmm. I mean, simply put, it's because I know what it's like to not love the life I wake up to. I know what it's like to not want to start another day and to just feel like there's no hope and there's no direction and there's nowhere to go. And that kind of sucks. I'm sure you understand that's not a great place to be in. And so having been in that place, having moved through that place, and now having kind of the tools and tips and tricks and stuff to get out of that place, it's something that I want to be able to help people get out of there too. Because it's no fun to be there. It's no fun to feel like you're doing that all alone and you have no one there to support you. So for me to be able to come in and say, hey, I've been there. It's no fun, but here's what I did. Maybe you can try this to get out of there. That's why I do what I do. In short, I know how much it is no fun, and I don't want anyone else to have to be that way either.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense. So which came first, speaker, author, or mental health advocate?
I think technically the speaker came first. The author came last. So my journey, I suppose, I started kind of in the field of entrepreneurship when I was a freshman in high school, and I coordinated 3 iterations of a run walk fundraiser that benefited families who were struggling with either the loss or the illness of their child. And that was something that I started straight up off the ground and really was involved in all aspects of it. So everything from marketing to website design to sponsor acquisition to volunteer management, I was kind of doing the whole thing there. That really taught me, everything, but it taught me a lot about what it meant to run your own thing, right? To have this dream, this image, and to take it from concept to completion. And then my first speech was actually when I was an 8th grader. It was my 8th grade graduation speech. And I was the valedictorian. And the speech was so bad because I was so nervous that I asked my friend to co-speak it with me. So we alternated lines, and it was just atrocious. But that was kind of my first introduction there. And then I spoke at some nonprofit things throughout high school, taught some seminars throughout college. And then really when I was in college, decided that this is what I wanted to do because I was so passionate about it. So I guess the speaker part came first. The mental health advocacy part came probably freshman, sophomore year of high school as well, when I started to really struggle with my mental health and see how pervasive of an issue that is, and how much just having conversations about it and shedding light on something that a lot of people want to keep in the shadows, how powerful that was. And so when I was like, oh, I can talk and I can also talk about mental health, wow, that's perfect. And just kind of took it from there.
That's awesome. And that is interesting with mental health, right? It's like, at least for me, it sounds like it was similar. Like you grow up and nobody talks about it. So then you feel like you're experiencing this thing that nobody else has ever gone through. And you're afraid to bring it up. And then when you bring it up, you realize, oh, wait, you felt this way? You felt this way? I'm more alike than I am different? Okay. And then there's power there.
It's exactly how it works. Once I kind of moved through my struggles, I started looking back at some of my friends from high school and hearing stuff about like, oh, she's still struggling with this, or he's no longer struggling with this. And I was like, they were struggling? I had no idea. I had no idea. I thought this was something that me and maybe one other person were struggling with. And to learn that that wasn't the case was really relieving and also kind of sad, but just really relieving to know that I wasn't alone in that.
Sure. So how do you walk somebody from the darkness into the light, right? I mean, first they have to want to, but what's a little bit of the process of how you're able to break it down and make it easier for someone to acknowledge it and then move through it?
The biggest thing that I do is I work from an advocacy perspective. So I'm not a therapist. I don't coach people. I think that that's something that a licensed therapist needs to do. But where my job comes in is really just holding that light in the first place, turning on the light, turning on the candle, whatever you want to use there as far as a metaphor, but showing people that it's okay to talk about this stuff. A lot of the presentations that I've done speaking at colleges and things like that, I'm the first person that some of these people have seen talk about mental health struggles and talk openly and candidly about what I went through, talk about what it took for me to get to where I am today. I'm the first person that they've ever heard do that. They don't think it's okay to talk about that, and to have this person stand up on stage in front of hundreds of people and tell those sides of their story, that's just revolutionary for them. And that can really start to break down some of that stigma and some of that hesitation about getting help and moving through this healing journey. I also do a lot of work in connecting people to resources. So my book is all about natural and integrative trauma therapies. And I just kind of discuss what happens in the therapy, what's the research surrounding it, how does it work, why does it work? And then, of course, how do you find someone who's trained and licensed in that field that you can work with? So my role is really kind of kicking them in the butt and getting the train started. And then that healing journey can flow with the help of the therapist, with the help of their friends and loved ones, things like that. That's kind of where I come in.
That's awesome. Yeah, you push them off the diving board, right?
Lovingly, but yes.
And then you have people there that can help them swim.
Yep, perfect.
I like that. So if you don't mind sharing, what was your journey with mental health, just for some context for everybody to understand where you were versus where you're at now?
No, definitely. So for me personally, I was really struggling with depression, some social anxiety. I had a really bad relationship with food. I was self-harming. And kind of that really tied into a relationship that I had with another individual who was on a very similar path. He was depressed, he was self-harming, he was suicidal. And I decided that I was going to take his world and put it on my shoulders and be responsible for his health and his happiness and essentially him staying alive. This is, as you can imagine, not a great way to support someone else that's taking way too much credit for their actions. And that was very detrimental for both of us. That relationship unfortunately ended with his suicide attempt and my calling the cops to prevent him from doing so. And that whole night, as well as kind of the year and a half before and the year and a half to 2 years afterwards, were just steeped in so much trauma and heavy emotion and just a decline of mental health for both of us. So that was kind of where I was, sitting in this place where I felt like I was struggling so deeply, but also responsible for someone else who was struggling, how to manage that, doing whatever it took to keep him happy because I thought that would keep him alive. And then recognizing that, it wasn't enough because he still wanted to, take his own life and that kind of whole situation. But that was, in short, my journey. And that was sophomore year of high school through probably freshman year of college for me.
Yeah, I was about to say, and all of that is at, 15 years old, right? Like that's a lot to put on anyone, let alone a 15-year-old.
And I feel like that adds another layer of complication as well, at least in my quest to keep this other human alive, is that when you're under 18, it's really, really hard to ask for help because there's no guaranteed confidentiality. If you say that you are at risk of hurting yourself or others, then they tell your parents, maybe they have to get law enforcement involved. And for someone who was hell-bent on keeping this secret, that was so threatening to me. So that just adds a whole nother level of complication to that whole situation for me.
I never knew that the confidentiality wasn't guaranteed. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's just because you're a minor, you're still under parental control because you're not 18 yet.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's interesting. So do you hear that a lot if you speak at like a high school or anything, that people come up and they're sort of afraid because they don't want it to be taken out of their control?
I don't speak at a lot of high schools. I do mostly colleges, but with speaking with high schoolers individually, that's definitely something I hear. It's like, my mom can't find out about this because of X, Y, and Z, therefore I can't ask for help. Or my school counselor found out, now she's going to tell my mom. How do I handle this sort of thing? So that's definitely a huge fear for people. And I will say, I understand why that rule is in place because you are a minor and you are at risk of hurting yourself or others. Like, you need that additional support. But it's already scary enough approaching a therapist and asking for help, and then recognizing that your privacy might not be respected. It turns a lot of people away from asking for help.
Right. Yeah, and maybe you get this a lot too, but as you're talking about that, I'm just thinking about the show on Netflix, 13 Reasons Why. You get that comparison a lot when you talk about that?
I get that brought up a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of people have mixed opinions on it. Some people think that it caused a bunch of people, a lot of kids, to have poor mental health and to attempt suicide and things like that. Other people thought it was a very good and potentially graphic way of bringing mental health struggles into the light. So it's brought up a lot, and there's a lot of mixed opinions about it.
So what's your opinion about it? Throw yours into the mix.
Yeah,
What do you
I think that suicide isn't pretty. Depression isn't pretty. It's not something that can be wrapped up into this nice little box or television show and put out for people. I think that it was kind of a good thing that it took something so dark and tragic and horrible and put it out there and said, this is what happens. This is what we're facing. This is how our teenage minds work and how they think and the struggles that they have. So I think it was a really good wake-up call for a lot of people. I think potentially when it started to take off, there could have been more support systems in place, whether that's school counselors really taking a role and saying, hey, if you need to talk about this show, my office is open, or whatever that is. But overall, I think it was a really accurate representation of high school mental health.
Yeah, I agree. And it's sort of like the shock therapy that some people needed. So it's like you can't just shove that under the rug, right? When it becomes part of pop culture, then it's everywhere and there's no escaping it.
And unfortunately, it is everywhere. Before it was pop culture.
Right.
I mean, there's an estimated, 50 to 70% of people will experience a trauma in their lifetimes, and a lot of people more than one trauma. Rates of depression are at an all-time high in certain populations. It is there. It is everywhere. And for now to have the media and families and schools and kids talking about it, even though it was a dramatic way of having it happen, I think it's a good thing overall.
Yeah. And so you said the book came last. So was the book sort of a summary of questions you were asked while you were speaking, things that you realized while you were sharing your story that, you can reach more people when you put it between a front and back cover?
Yeah, it was actually kind of everything I wish I knew when I was healing. So I went to one day of talk therapy when I was 17, and that whole confidentiality thing was huge for me too then. But I was so uncomfortable with talk therapy that I literally ran out of the building and I never went back. And that's one of my biggest regrets in my healing journey is I feel like I could have healed a lot more smoothly, a lot faster, and in a lot more of a straight line if I had that professional help from someone. But talk therapy was never going to do it for me. I never would have been comfortable enough to go when I needed it, let alone even now. I'm still kind of like, ooh, about talk therapy.
Yeah, so forgive my ignorance for a second. Is talk therapy just like talking to a therapist?
Yeah, so talk therapy is kind of what you think of where you're laying on a couch and someone's talking to you. But it's things like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, but basically, yes, talking between you and a therapist.
Got it.
Yeah. So I wanted to look at other methods of healing. And I was taking a nature-based therapies course in college, and I was like, oh, there's these other ways that you can heal. There's these other things that you can do. And so I started kind of digging more into that world of natural and integrative therapies, learned about lots of other ones, and some that are often better than talk therapy for trauma because they have that mind-body piece, which can help with the somatic piece of trauma. But really just started looking at these and thinking, my God, if I knew this information when I needed it most, I would have been so much better off. So with this book, I wanted to give that information to other trauma survivors who didn't know that there were other options, who thought that it was either talk therapy or bust, and show them that, hey, you can still get the help you need and deserve, but in a way that is maybe more comfortable for you and maybe more effective overall.
Yeah, and that's what comes to mind for me is like everybody's trauma is different, right? So why should we think that everybody should have the same remedy for that trauma, right? Just talk therapy is not going to work for everybody. Depending on who you are and your personality and what you went through, then it might take one of these different ones.
Absolutely. The other thing with talk therapy too is that it's a very cognitive, logical, developed approach. It's something that you think about and talk about with your prefrontal cortex, but trauma is in your limbic system and it is in your primal brain. And so when you get triggered or you're having a flashback or you're struggling with trauma, that's not a cognitive response. It's very primal, it's very somatic, and it's in your hindbrain. So these logical approaches to healing, they aren't going to do you as well in those instances. having something that's movement based and somatic and maybe working with animals or being outdoors, that's going to tie into that primal piece a little bit better than something that's very cognitive and logical. So that's just another reason that sometimes these alternative therapies are maybe better than simply talk therapy.
So how does that work then? I'm looking at your book page right now. One of them is equine assisted therapy. So working with horses.
Mm-hmm.
How does being around a horse help heal trauma?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, horses are very intuitive. And I'll tell you a story to illustrate that. There was a client who came to an equine assisted therapy facility. She wasn't there for a session. She just kind of showed up to see what it was like. And she was interacting with this horse in a field. And the horse came up and kind of nibbled on her arm, walked around the field, came back, chomped on her arm a little bit harder. And she's like, oh, walked around the field again, came back and bit this woman's arm. And through that process of, oh, it's so cute. Oh, wow, he really loves me, to, oh, ow, that hurts. She was able to recognize that that was a replication, a metaphor for the abusive relationship that she was in. And that allowed her story to kind of come out and talk to the therapists that were there and get the healing that she needed. So that horse sensed something in her that made him do that to her in order to catalyze her story coming out. So that's one thing. Horses are really intuitive. The second part of it is that it's very movement-based and very symbolic. So part of one of the forms of equine-assisted therapy is that you can move the stage of the horses in the field and some props to illustrate changes in your own life. So if you're feeling like life is moving way too quickly, you can literally slow down the scene at the equine-assisted therapy facility and then have that symbolic kind of slow down in your own life as well. Or if everything is really stagnant, you can move horses around in order to kind of stimulate that movement in your own life. As another example, sometimes you will really identify with a horse. So, okay, I identify with this horse, and then this other horse identifies as trauma. Like that feels like trauma to me. And then if your trauma horse bites the horse that you identify with, you can move that horse to a safe place, which again, symbolically moves you to a safe place. And it's just getting this stuff flowing and getting it moving. And of course, the therapists are there so you can talk to them and work through stuff as well. But it's that added layer of seeing things change in front of you instead of literally just sitting there and talking about it. That can be really powerful.
Yeah. Getting outside your own head and sort of projecting it on something else that is a part of the world that you can sort of interact with and not just in your brain that you can't see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One of the equine assisted therapy therapists actually that I talked to, she always tells her clients, she's like, if you can move a 2,000-pound animal around and calm it down when it's scared, then you can absolutely do the same thing for yourself, which is so true. It's such a good line. And that's really empowering for some people as well that are just terrified and frightened of everything. To know that they can have a calming presence on this giant animal is really empowering for a lot of people.
Sure. So what's something that people get wrong about your journey? Right? Do you get anybody that like they draw false conclusions? You be kind of putting yourself out there in the spotlight. If you're like, hey, if you only knew,
Yeah, I think the biggest one for me is that a lot of people look at my journey and they think that it's very random. So kind of in chronological order, I did the nonprofit work. I was thinking about going into the nonprofit space, but my heart was really in animals and in saving lives. So I went to vet school for a year. Realized that vet school wasn't a good fit, but I still wanted to save lives. So I went to get my EMT license with the plan of being a paramedic. Didn't go to paramedic school because the parental units were like, you need to finish your undergrad degree. So went back to finish my undergrad degree. While there, I was like, I still want to save lives. Like sitting in a classroom is not doing it for me. So I was going to go into the Air Force as a pararescueman, which is a mixture of a trauma paramedic and a search and rescue specialist, but unfortunately was ineligible for military service because of my mental health history. So that was out. And then was kind of left with, okay, what do I do now? What am I passionate about? And that's where the mental health piece combined with the speaking piece combined with the entrepreneurship piece kind of came together. But a lot of people look at that and they're like, wow, she had no idea what she was doing. And she was kind of all over the place with this. But throughout that whole journey, I stayed really true to my definition of fulfillment, which is that I'm giving people their time back. I'm giving them another chance at life. And that is true for vet school. I mean, it was with animals, but it's true for vet school. It's true with emergency medicine. And it's true with mental health as well, because when you're living with depression or you're living with PTSD, you are not living your best life. And to have someone come in and give you the courage and give you the resources to take back your life, that's just as powerful as literally saving someone's life by stopping, their heart from doing weird things or whatever it is.
Sure. Yeah, in some ways more powerful, more difficult. It's not like a CL clear and hit the defibrillator. It's much more much more complex. That type of saving. Yeah. So what does it look like for you to wake up to a life you love? How do you define that?
For me, it's more about an elimination of dread. When I was really struggling with my mental health, I'd wake up and I'd be like, oh, not another day. I have to go to school or see people or talk to people or whatever it was. There's just all these things that I didn't want to do. And it's not to say that my life now doesn't have struggles or doesn't have things that go wrong. That is so not true. I mean, there's still ups and downs every single day. But I wake up excited to make an impact that I get to make. I wake up excited to have conversations with people, to make connections with people, to give back to people. And it's that excitement as opposed to dread that really defines the fact that, yeah, I have a life that I love waking up to, even though there are still struggles here and there.
I love that. Yeah. I went through something similar, when I was talking before about finally talking about it and feel like it wasn't just me, right? I didn't know what to call it, but then, really somebody framed it for me as some form of anxiety where I was waking up with that dread and panic attacks that I didn't know were called panic attacks at the time, right? And it isn't, I would describe it exactly like you described it though, like that dread. I never thought of that before. You wake up and you're like, you just do not want to go to your own life that day,
Yep.
And that's hard. That's really hard. And it takes sort of getting, go back to my defibrillator metaphor, right? Shocked. Something you shock your system. And then you have to claim it back, and it's easier said than done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that analogy, though, by the way. I'm going to use that
great.
analogy in
You're
the
welcome.
future.
You're welcome to it. So you said a lot of people think your journey is kind of sporadic and all over the place, but to you, it's been constant. If you had to describe that journey, so far to the point where you're at in 3 words, what 3 words would you choose?
I would choose redefining my failures. And the reason that I choose those 3 words is that I looked at that period in my life where I was struggling with my mental health as just this giant black mark that I never wanted to talk about. I didn't want anyone to know about. It was something I was so ashamed of. And I lived that way for years after I had kind of gotten out of those mental health struggles. And it was just, I just had this moment one day where I was sitting there and I was like, I'm trying to grow and I'm trying to develop and live this life while simultaneously hating a part of myself and my story. That's not productive. That's not a good way to go about life. That's going to be really, really hard to see the success that you want. And so I was like, okay, how can I use that time in my life for good? How can I make a difference with that? How can I make that time not a waste, right? How can I take advantage of that and use it to build a career, to have authentic connections and conversations, to make a difference in the world? And I was able to no longer look at that as a failure, but as something that I'm comfortable standing on stage and talking about, or being on a podcast and talking about, or talking one-on-one, whatever that is. But it's no longer this black mark of a failure for me. It's something that I use as the centerpiece of my life and my business, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I've talked about that before with some people. For me, that word failure, I think it's sometimes used where we should be using the word setback. Like, for me, failure is when you just completely throw in the towel and give up. Mm-hmm. But a setback is just that, 2 steps back to take another 1 giant step forward again, And so looking at it that way, like you're not done. It's just a bump in the road. It's a setback versus a failure. That's how that's how I redefine it. And you're right. It's very powerful when you realize, you don't have to carry that chip around on your shoulder. Like you said, you become grateful for the negative or the past negative. And then that allows you to look forward to the future positive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can always find some lesson in it, right? Like I would never wish trauma or mental health struggles on anyone, but I also don't believe I would be empathetic or as communicative or as vulnerable or have as deep connections with people as I do now if I hadn't been through that. So it's not necessarily helpful when you're in the trenches to be like, oh, this is all going to be okay someday. That's not really helpful. But you can look back on it. You can say, I would not have this amazing thing, or I would not be this person if I didn't go through what I went through all those weeks, months, years ago, whatever it is for you.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm laughing at the thought. I'm talking to somebody who's in the deepest of low, like, don't worry, one day you'll be grateful for this. That's not what you want to say. Or,
no,
but that's what people end up saying. I think that's why people hate talk therapy or talking about it, because people just feed them that BS, You'd rather have a horse bite you in the arm than have someone tell you everything's going to be okay in that moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's almost disrespectful. It's like I just opened up to you and told you about something that I'm struggling with, and your response is a pat on the back saying, it's all going to be okay someday. It's just it's so not acknowledging where you are right now and that your feelings are valid and that what you're going through is valid.
Right.
That's something I actually talk about a lot in my presentations. My one presentation is, how do you support someone who's struggling? What do you not say? And that's one of them, that it's all going to be okay. It's all for the better in the long run, sort of thing.
Yeah. Sometimes it's better. You just don't say anything. Just sit there. Give them a hug.
Yes.
You don't have to say anything back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that.
So if people love what you've been saying, where can we send them to find more of what you got going on?
Yeah, definitely. So I am on Facebook and Instagram at Jessi Beyer International. That is Jessi, B as in boy, Eyer, International. And then you can also actually go read the first 3 chapters of my book, which talk more about my story and what trauma is and things like that on my website at jessibeyerinternational.com/chapters.
Awesome. And we can link up to all that stuff in the show notes too, man. That'll make it easy.
Perfect.
Well, I appreciate your time and you sharing the story that you did with us tonight. I think it just helps further your mission of helping people wake up, loving the life that they live, at least realizing maybe that you're in some dread, right? And they can get started. We're shining the light.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great to chat with you.
All right, everybody, that'll do it for another episode of Relish the Journey. Thank you all so much for listening. If you connected with this episode, if you connected with Jessi's story, if you know someone that needs to hear that story, please share this podcast with them. It's all about shining the light on some uncomfortable situations so that we can move from that darkness into the light and truly love the lives we wake up to. So appreciate Jessi for sharing her story, for everything she does. Be sure to check out the links we put in the show notes for more of what she's doing and to follow her on her journey. Until next time, everybody, cheers.